At this time, it's my pleasure, and I'm sure you're definitely tired of looking at me anyway, and you're hoping that today doesn't consist of me, and it doesn't. So I'm actually done for the most part for the day. It's my pleasure to introduce Christopher Zimmerman. Christopher is Smart Growth America's Vice President for Economic Development. He's an economist by training. Chris leads Smart Growth America's technical assistance programs for downtown revitalization and transit-oriented development. Prior to joining Smart Growth America, Chris served 18 years as an elected official in Arlington County, Virginia. During that time, he served on the WMATA Board of Directors and the Transportation Planning Board for the National Capital Region. Prior to his service as an elected official, Chris was chief economist at the National Conference of State Legislatures. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing Chris Zimmerman.
Thank you, Phil. Good morning. Executive Pittman, thank you very much for the opportunity you've given Smart Growth America to participate in this very important effort that you're kicking off today. I think it's possible that you may have gleaned from the introduction that I am the only person in the room who cannot claim to live or have lived in the great state of Maryland. I think you might have heard that I reside in another Chesapeake-based state that we won't name, because I'm not sure if people would cheer in this room. But other than me, as it turns out, the team we've brought actually has much connection here. My colleague Jerry Mincer over here was born, raised, has family all over this state. And my colleague Marta Goldsmith, who runs the Form-Based Codes Institute at Smart Growth America, lives in another county, but many, many years in the state of Maryland. And then there's my third colleague, who I'll say something about in a moment. First, though, I want to say something about us. So in case you don't know us, and there's no particular reason to presume you would have, Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit organization. We're based in Washington, D.C., but we do our work pretty much all over the country. I believe we have at one time or another been in all of the 50 states. Not me personally, although I've gotten to quite a few of them over the last 6 years. And what you need to know, I mean, we have a bunch of different programs that you may occasionally run into the names of that come under our organization. But what's really important is what we're for. And the sentence up there that starts the paragraph there is really what our vision is for the country. Smart Growth America envisions a country where no matter where you live, no matter who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. Our work is to empower communities through technical assistance, advocacy, and thought leadership to realize our vision of livable places, healthy people, and shared prosperity. That's what we're about. So we're really pleased to be able to be here and assist with this, which is a really big job, because thinking about the future of a community on into the decades ahead, that's a big job anywhere. Trying to do it in a community as large and varied as Arundel is a really big job. So it's really important that we have a lot of people to help do that. And it's great that so many people are here right at the outset, because it is going to be an extended job to do. But it has great rewards for your community in the future. I can say that because I had the opportunity to do that sort of thing in my own community, and I think we already see the benefits of having engaged in a collective effort to figure out what's working in our community, what's not working in our community, what do we need to do different, how do we need to change things to make the future that we want. Now, one of the things we say at Smart Growth America often is, if it's not local, it's not smart growth. Ultimately, every decision in a community that's really important has to have the most important expertise. And the most important expertise are the people who live there. We can bring a lot of knowledge from various places, and there are technical issues and all that. But nobody knows a community better than the people who actually live there. So in a very real way, you are the experts. And ultimately, the decisions are going to be the ones you make working with your own officials. And we can't tell you what that ultimately looks like. We can, however, tell you a lot about the things that go beyond just the boundaries of your own jurisdiction, things that are affecting every community around the country, changes in the economy and demographics and so on, that form the context within which you have to make these decisions, figure out these plans. And that's where we're going to start. So we're going to be starting at a very general level and then bringing it into the more and more specific local level. Now, to do that, we're going to have a little introduction from somebody who is particularly well suited to do it. Now, my colleague who's going to give us the introduction is somebody who I think I could really say in this room needs no introduction, but he's going to get one anyway. But what I'm not going to say much about, well, I'm not going to say anything about, is the 2 terms he spent as governor of this state, because people in this room probably know more about that than I do. But I do want to say 3 things that you need to know about him that is relevant to today and to what he's about to present to you. Number 1, apart from great things he did for the state of Maryland, he was one of the founders of the movement of smart growth, and certainly did more than any other elected official in the country to promulgate the idea around the country and get people focused on something that is today as important as ever, and among which he helped to found Smart Growth America. So his knowledge goes beyond just the time he spent in the State House here. The second thing you need to know, and this is really important to me, as you heard that I'm a recovering politician. You never actually recover, you know. We used to always say among my local elected colleagues in the days I was there that we should change the constitution of our state so that you had to be governor. It was a prerequisite that you work in local government. We never got very far with that, but we were absolutely certain that we would have better governors if they served in local government. Well, my colleague actually may have spent 8 years in state government, but he spent 23 years before that preparing it in the most important level of government, local government, and 12 years, in fact, as county executive over in another county out here. So he brings knowledge and understanding of what we actually do at the local level, which is extremely relevant to what you're going to be doing. And the third thing you need to know, and you may know, but it bears repeating because I don't think this has ever happened in any technical assistance that I've worked on around the country. He apparently really liked the place that he came to as governor, and he's never left. So he's a resident like all of you and will live with the consequences of what all of you decide just as much as all of you will. So without further ado, I give you my colleague, your former governor and current neighbor, the Honorable Parris Glendening.
Chris, thank you very much, and also want to say he's relatively modest in that he is a significant expert through experience about transit and what can be done with transit and how you bring transit to a community and things of this type. And in fact, before he finishes, he'll probably be able to propose an entire transit program for the entire county. Chris, we do appreciate your work and working with you. Let me give a special thank you to County Executive Stuart Pittman. You would expect that of a speaker. You know, thank you, host. You know, it was great. But I want to tell you, I came home from hearing him speak one time, and I said, he gets it. He gets it. He understands. Not just the concept of smart growth and so on, but he gets it in knowing what is bothering people so much about the community and what is going on. And then I heard him not only in that speech, but in his inaugural, saying he wants to make Anne Arundel County a model for the entire state, even the entire country, in terms of how we can do this. If there's anyone that's going to be able to do that, I think it's going to be Stuart. And Stuart, thank you for your leadership. Now, I went down to our colleagues, our offices in D.C., went down to our colleagues, and I told them what had happened in terms of this election. And I've got to tell you, there were a few people there because we work with elected officials all over the country, and they said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "I'm sure." And then he reaffirmed, not just by his inaugural comments, but by today and by everything that he is doing as well. And we look forward to working with you. Let me also thank the County Office of Planning and Zoning for the great work in terms of bringing everything together here. And I'm really impressed that they're going to be able to take all of these thoughts, pull them together. No one is going to be upset. Everyone is going to be happy with the outcome, and it can be done. Let me just make a quick observation. Chris mentioned that I was for 31 years an elected official in this state, and then I was also for 27 years a faculty member at the University of Maryland College Park, and now I'm in my 15th year heading Smart Growth America's Leadership Institute. I was introduced like that a couple of years ago when I was speaking in Chicago on gender equity issue, and with modesty, I thought I gave a reasonably good speech, and finished up and asked were there questions or comments, and one young person sitting up front raised a hand real quickly and said, "How old are you anyway?" True story, absolute true story. I'm not 107 years old, but if you put all that together, it might sound like it, but it's just a matter of when you're a local official, you normally do other things as well. That's what my college career was on. As Chris mentioned, I'm going to be giving kind of the view from 20, 30,000 feet. And then we will be breaking out and have a lot of additional discussions, and this will be an ongoing process, and you hopefully will, operating in that context of the view from 30,000 feet, try to pull some of these things together. And so let me start that by asking everyone to remember that you are not just automatically born an environmentalist or automatically born as someone who understands these issues. You're probably wondering why in the world we have the Florida Everglades up here to start this off. I was actually raised in Florida. I was born in New York, raised in Florida, and lived in South Florida, close to the Everglades. Went to Florida State University, being unable to get into Maryland, but I went to, I didn't used to say that, but in any case, I was working my way through college, and we would go from Florida State, from Tallahassee, down to where I had a job in a machine shop in Hialeah, Florida. And it was about 500 miles, and I would drive what they called the back routes, because no sense in going to work and having to pay tolls and all that sort of stuff. And this was the Everglades at that time. It had a clear delineation. Since then, and starting during that period, they have built into the Everglades and built into the Everglades, subdivision after subdivision. And now it's 40 miles out into the glades, all kinds of subdivisions and things of this type. Now, the reason I mention this, I wasn't an environmentalist. I wasn't thinking environmental policy. I didn't think about any of these things. But I remember riding along this edge, Route 441, and seeing these subdivisions and everything going up and thinking to myself, this is not right. This is not going to work. And part of the reason I was thinking about it is I used to go out there fishing and things like this, and I knew what it was. It was a swampland. It was the reservoir really for the water and everything for South Florida. Well, they built out there, and you see what's happening now. There are water problems, there are storm problems, there's everything going on we could anticipate, and now the federal government is spending $20 billion over the next 2 decades trying to recapture some of the Everglades, which was lost. Now, I say that, so I moved up then to Maryland and got involved in local government. I remember sitting in the Hyattsville City Council, and Hyattsville, beautiful community, a lot of 1880, 1920 homes and things of this type, except for US 1, which was a series of used car lots, just plain downright ugly. Now you understand when I was on the city council, I never called it ugly, but it was. And I had asked people, why don't we redevelop this? Why don't we get some really nice businesses and everything in here and be able to work on this? And I remember going to one business person who told me there was an old telephone building. I said, let's make this a condominium or an office building or something instead of being abandoned on US 1. And they said, you know, it's easier for me to go out to Greenbelt or Bowie and buy a farm and build a whole subdivision, a whole office park, than it is for me to revitalize, to reuse that old building. And then they started going through why the laws were set up, the regulations were set up in a way that doesn't encourage, and in fact discourages, people reinvesting in existing communities and makes it easy for you to go out there and build. And that's when the lights started going on. Something is terribly wrong. Now, by the way, if you haven't been to College Park or Hyattsville at all in recent years, you should go down there and you should see what has taken place in terms of investment and walkability to transit and everything else that is occurring in that area. And in part because we changed the laws, we changed the regulations. And so then, as Prince George's executive, I started looking at both our rivers, the Patuxent, the Anacostia, and the Potomac in that case, and the Chesapeake Bay. And so I figured, how can we change this? How can we protect these great resources? I remember, for example, right in this county, over at the Jug Bay area, where there was going to be a major subdivision built. We fortunately purchased that land and kept it open forever. But the question started to become, it's not about point source pollution at all, nearly as much as it is on what we are doing in terms of sprawl. The cutting down of the trees, the erosion of the soil, the impervious surfaces going up. No matter what you do, you can have 100% pure effluent coming out of every plant in the state, and you're still going to lose the bay if we continue these practices. And so looking at this, and this is the sprawl that we don't have a name on there, and the reason we don't, this is everywhere America. This is what's going on just about every place. I tell visitors that come from abroad studying some of these things, I said, no matter where you fly in, look down, and this is what you're going to see out the airport window. Now, and that is where we must start with the solutions. And we're going to be talking about some of these today, about how to halt the sprawl patterns that we find, and how to recognize how bad this is. When you look at that site, you can see nothing, right? I mean, there's nothing else there. There's no real walkability. There are no, what we have designed deliberately is a system where now you must get into a 2,000-pound machine, the car, and drive 2 miles to get 1 quart of milk. I hope everyone recognizes something illogical in doing this. And it's not just about what we build, it's about what we leave behind, the disinvestment that takes place. You know, corridors all over, in fact, a few from here. I'm amazed at the number of empty stores that I go past on Forest Drive to my home because someone has built a new one further out. And we just keep going on this, and this becomes the pattern of America. So in addition to the sprawl, we now face abandoned places, places that are facing extraordinary disinvestment all over the country and all over our state and significantly over this county as well. So our challenge then is to revitalize our downtowns. And downtown, by the way, we're not just talking about an actual town of Annapolis, but our commercial areas and especially our corridors, and to revitalize them and make our communities a wonderful place to live, to work, to grow our families, to have a real sense of community, and while we are doing that, to preserve our farmlands and our open spaces and our natural resources. If you think about what has happened in the last century, you see certain commonalities here all across the country. We've built an economy that was based on manufacturing in the last century. We emptied our cities and towns for the greenfield suburban communities, and we grew our local communities around highways and with the deliberate projects, policies that influence the sprawl. I emphasize this point because what you see is that sprawl just didn't occur like magic, it's just popped up. Sprawl was a result of actual deliberate policies. And I'm not even talking about zoning and land use decisions, deliberate policies like building an interstate highway system, like putting a tax system together that encourages this type of real estate investment and rapid depreciation. It goes from one area after another in policy. And the reason that becomes important, if policies cause this, then let's change the policies and get what we want instead in terms of land use. Across the country, and Chris mentioned this, but there's been a significant movement toward smart growth, toward revitalization of the downtown areas, toward preserving open space. Sometimes it's a full smart growth program, sometimes it's just parts of it. And so what I wanted to address a little bit this morning is why is that happening in so many places, in literally thousands of communities. Now, most of you immediately say it's probably because of my great speeches and bringing people to this, but there are other things going on that we've got to recognize, because if the force of change is there, then we have to figure how can we harness that force of change to move in the direction that we want to go. The first of these major forces is demographics. If you notice here in terms of the growth, the demographics, the two biggest growing and projected where most of the growth of the population will be are the millennials and the baby boomers. And you see the bulge for both of these. And what we are recognizing is that these are the groups that are influencing the development process. These are the groups that are creating the market. These are the groups that are deciding where they want to live. It is not just the growth of that, but it's also a dramatic change in the households themselves. If you really look at this chart, it is significant. Just in 1960, half of the households had children. By now, we're down to approaching 30%, and we're moving to 28% of the households. I mean, 3/4 of the households will not have children. And then you look at the bottom on the single households has more than doubled, so one person in a household. The reason this becomes important is you got to realize that acre and a half subdivision with 5 bedrooms and all is just not where we should be. And it's not where the market is growing, and it's not where we should be planning our future. We also should know that households are different, and even for baby boomers. The baby boomers, people like me, are living longer, they're working longer, and they're still active in the community much, much longer. They're not moving to the standard process in the past. They're not moving to retirement homes in South Florida or in South Carolina. I tell people sometimes, and this may sound a little bit harsh, but the old model used to be that you retire about 60 and you die about 70. And I know that's a little harsh, especially if you're in that age group, but that was the model. And so many of our things were built on that. Our retirement systems, our Social Security, our health programs and all, they were built on this premise. Well, so was the development pattern, and so was everything that was going on, that we're going to have this constantly large family movement and things of this type. It's changing. It's not only changing because the baby boomers want now to stay in the community, to be active in the community, but also, in many cases, there's just an economic necessity. Now what the Census Bureau says, if you are reasonably healthy at 63, your overwhelming odds are you'll be reasonably healthy at 83. And so now, what are you going to do with this additional time? You're not going to sit on the back porch and rock. You're going to be involved. You must be involved in many cases as well. And so what we're looking at then is choices for our community. both the millennials and the baby boomers want the same thing. And if you look at some of our choices right here, I know where that is, that traffic congestion, because I used to be on that. That's out in South Florida. But it doesn't make any difference. We see that every place, including right here in Maryland. And you see the same subdivision. Or do you want to be able to walk? Do you want to be able to live in a place with a sense of community? The same is true for housing preferences. Significant changes in housing on the other side on the lifestyle. The millennials choose where to live. The interesting thing is they choose where they want, what the kind of community they want before they take a job. And this becomes important in terms of economic development as well as attracting, retaining the younger portion of our population. You know, when I graduated, I never heard of this idea that, gee, I'd like to live here, let me go see if there's a job there. The way I did it is you went where the jobs were. And I'm assuming this is true for most of you as well. So I went to New York, I went to a conference for political science, I was getting my doctorate, and I got several job offers, one in Texas, which I immediately wrote off, one in Maryland, one in Massachusetts, and I came here. Now, what they do is they say, I really want to live in or want to live here, and that's where they go. And they look for a place where there is a sense of place. And as we will talk about in a second, that is why businesses are making the decisions that they are making as well. Our different preferences in transportation. This one, the transportation one, walkable and all. Jerry, the housing, yeah, that's why I was looking for, the housing choice. They also have a significant difference in housing choices. What we find now is the millennials, when you look at this, 47% of the millennials, half of them, prefer living in a more urbanized, walkable community. This is overwhelming preference. 40% would like to live in a moderately small town area, Annapolis. And only 12% still look toward the traditional subdivision upon which most of our plans are built. And in fact, we'll see as you go to modify the general plan that how many subdivisions are still on the books as if there was people out there wanting that. When you're thinking about economic development and where we're going as a prosperous county, and this is something, Stuart, we've talked about as well, one of the things to keep in mind is watch the mix of ages in a community. And you can tell an awful lot about the economic future for that community. If you have a community, a state, a county, a municipality that is consistently aging, getting older, what that tells you is that the young people, the millennials, either do not want to or cannot come to that community. And unless that is turned around, it is going to be a long-term fiscal hardship for everyone there. And by the way, it's not just the wonderful success stories you see in some of our larger cities that this is happening dramatically, like Washington, D.C. or Pittsburgh, but it's even some of our smallest communities. Berlin, Maryland, down on the Eastern Shore, a very small community. Its average age has been declining significantly because young people have been moving to Berlin, Maryland. Most of you probably just know that by driving by it on your way to Ocean City or the shore or whatever, but it is doing extraordinarily well because it pulled together a lot of these principles. It's important to remember that what we need is a mixture. This one in Greenville, South Carolina, we've been working with them. They're doing extraordinarily well on that, and it's all across the country. This is Iowa City, Iowa, which among other things, when you look at what they've done, they've reused and reinvested. The reason I like this one in South Bend, Indiana, is if you see those buildings in the background, those are old mills that were abandoned, that were closed, and they have been revitalized, redone with the standard formula that we strongly recommend of retail along the bottom, redesign the streets, bring people into the streets, onto the streets, into the community, and residential or office up above. Again, and you see this right in Annapolis, Madam Mayor, but you see how difficult it is to use the second floor in many of those buildings. And it's all about codes and regulations and all. Obviously you want public safety, but it can be done, and this is an example of exactly that. Millennials also want their parents and grandparents to be in the same community and active in the same community, not in a retirement home. And the reverse is true. Parents would like their children to be someplace reasonably close. And so all of this comes together in the pattern itself for development. Now, the second major force that's driving economic development is, and it's changing it significantly, but it's about the workers, about especially in the knowledge-based economy. As you see this statement here, that talent is replacing the tax incentive is the #1 economic development tool in America. This is happening in a very significant way. Companies are increasingly saying, where is the labor pool that I need? You saw all the publicity on the Amazon West Coast headquarters and what was going on. Virginia ended up capturing that. I give them great credit on it. Among other things, they did have a tax incentive, which I got to tell you, I'm absolutely convinced the wealthiest country and the wealthiest man in the world did not need. But what they did need, and what they were so happy about and made key part of their decision, Virginia committed to building a new Virginia Tech campus right adjacent to the Amazon, and to work into training and education of the workforce on that as well. And so when you start to look at this, what we're finding is businesses locate based on where the talented pool of employees, of workers are. And we're seeing this all across the country. We did a study called Core Values. We looked at the 500 companies that made decisions to move from either the suburbs or most often a suburban office park to a downtown area. Now downtown, we literally in many cases mean downtown, but it also could have been a Bethesda or Silver Spring or something of this type as well. And what we found was that 82% of the executives making the decision said that the attracting and retaining the millennial workforce, the shiny brights coming out of college and everything, was the main reason for their location decision. And we've seen this over and over. They talk about the workforce, #1. #2, they look at transportation, and specifically a combination of walkability and transit. And #3, a real sense of place. And they do that because that's where the young people are in terms of making the decisions. The traditional suburban office park simply doesn't make it anymore. Probably one of the most famous Jerry, back up one second. The walk score, I was supposed to mention this as well. The walk score is a device that is used all over the country now. Realtors use it at every place and things of this type. But basically it tells you of your 7 trips a day, and that's what most Americans take, to and from work, kids to school, out to dinner, whatever it might be. How many of those are walkable? And what they found was that what was the before number?
Where they were located before they moved down.
Yeah, I mean, what was the number? Okay. All right, and you see that? I can't see it from here for some reason. Right. And now, and the relocation moved to 88, right? Meaning the decisions were made because that is what the young people and that is what the baby boomers very much want. One of the most notable examples of this is a more famous office park, one of the most famous office parks in America. And that was the Research Triangle Park down in Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina. It's very famous because it's got 3 major universities fairly close, and for years the best known research, knowledge-based companies were located in that park. What they found, and I was several years ago talking to the executive director for the park, and she was telling me they were losing their clients, their tenants, because they were all moving downtown to different places, to Raleigh, to Durham, and places like that. And the reason they were is the young folks did not want to come out, drive to an office park surrounded by asphalt, park there, get in their car and drive back home. They wanted to be able, like my son Raymond, who many of you know is now 39, he doesn't mind working until 9 o'clock at night, but when he comes down that elevator and goes across the street and meets a couple friends for a drink, I'm assuming coffee, but when he goes over there, has a drink or whatever, then he gets on Metro, he lives in DC, takes 2 stops, goes home, he and his wife go walk out to dinner, all choice of restaurants and all, and this has become kind of the standard in what they need. The Research Triangle Park, which you see up in the corner over there, is now being totally redeveloped. They are now adding residential units in there. They're adding retail on the ground floor. They're adding walkable areas, and they are starting to attract, again, some of the companies that were leaving. GE, General Electric, just made a major movement a couple of years ago from the suburbs of Connecticut to downtown Boston. And what they said, among other things, their company is shifting from simply manufacturing appliances that many of us think of GE about, and they're now doing 3D computer brain imaging capabilities and things like that has now become their dominant product. And that is a knowledge-based one, and they've decided they must be in a place like Boston where millennials are attracted on just a normal basis. We've seen the same thing in terms of in Maryland. There was a great discussion about Marriott, their headquarters, which was an old-fashioned office park. They made a decision to move, and they put a request out for proposals, and among other things, they said they wanted 2 things. It had to be a walkable community with a sense of place, and it had to be transit accessible. Now, they chose Bethesda, and they are redoing their headquarters there right now. These are location decisions that affect our prosperity and that generate the bottom line for both the private sector and the public sector. And our goal really should be a shared prosperity where there is economic opportunity for everyone. And I say this with a bit of emphasis because in many times when we are successful on the revitalization of a particular community, we are also, sadly, successful in forcing other people out based on the cost of the value of the land and the availability, Stuart, of affordable housing. And so as we go through the goals that we're looking here, we've got to keep in mind an added goal of shared prosperity. The third force that is affecting decisions like this all across the country is the one that led into there, and that is the growing inequity that is actually tearing our country apart. What we see is a major shrinking of the middle class. This is by the Pew Foundation, and you can see what is going on. As they said in their conclusion, the middle class is losing ground as a share of the population and as a share of aggregate U.S. households is also declining. Many of our urban areas are dangerous, really becoming homes only for the very wealthy and the very poor. And this is the reason there's such angst in many areas from the middle class. We urge strongly that every decision, as you go through this process, should look through a prism, a lens. I still have a little bit of southern accent. Some people said, go through a prison. It was not a prison, a prism, a lens that asks one question as before you make any type of decision is, does this action that we're getting ready to do reduce or expand the inequality in our communities? And we have to address that. What we find, for example, on transit development, A person might have a piece of property that all of a sudden is worth X number of dollars, and we come in and we build a new station, and we give higher density zoning and mixed use zoning, and all of a sudden that property becomes so expensive that it becomes almost impossible for the average Marylander to live there. This is true all across the country. I don't know how many of you saw this, but just yesterday, maybe the day before, because I read it electronically, but in the New York Times, there was a story about affordable housing, housing that's specifically designed for people that need assistance, that 450,000 of those homes have been built over the years in floodplains. And now, because that's the cheapest land, and you know what they were doing, okay, we have to build some affordable housing. Oh, here's some cheap land, and then you give a private developer a grant to go ahead and do this. You should go back and check that story. It really has implications about what's going on. Well, now we get climate change, and all of a sudden those areas are flooding over and over. And our policies are such that what does the government do, starting with the federal government on down? They simply pay to have it rebuilt. Many of you may know, by the way, and some of you may recall, but we had a relocation of public housing in Annapolis back when I was in office. And the area that they first proposed wasn't exactly a floodplain, but it also was not very desirable. When you cross the bridge as you're going into Annapolis, you see those what look like townhouses over there overlooking the river. That is the public housing that we replaced. The people now live on that program. I feel proud about that. We were criticized at the time, though. We were told that that was too lovely a property to use for public housing. Now, public housing, by the way, we're talking about not just Section 8 and things like this, we're talking about senior housing. We're talking about all kinds of, anyone that needs assistance in housing. And so if you go through this, please keep this equity issue in mind. The final powerful force that is impacting all these decisions and will be more and more is that of climate change. What we need is a constant awareness of climate change on both sides of the equation. By that we mean mitigation, so we don't contribute to the problem and make it worse, and resiliency. No matter what we do, there's going to be significant climatic events that we have to, in one way or another, provide the most resiliency possible. Climate change is real. We have here two maps. Interestingly, the far one for me, if you look at that, is a map that people understand that it's real, and they agree that climate change is a danger to the country and to the world. There's only one or two places that people deny the science of it, and unfortunately it's located in the White House, but we won't go there this morning. But the interesting thing, however, is this other map, and it's the darker of the color, the more people agree with it. The second map is whether it is a personal danger, whether it's going to harm us personally. And I don't know whether it's a type of denial or what occurs on this, but most people do not believe it is an immediate personal threat to them. But I'm here, sadly, to say, unfortunately, that is not true. Climate change is a real danger to real people, meaning us. And so we have to keep in mind what is going on. The great storms that we're all familiar with, in this case, Sandy and Harvey. We know that climate change is bringing all kinds of dangers around our country. The continued droughts, the related massive fires that result from that, the rainfall, these microbursts that cause the floods, and they're increasing all over the country, and the dangerous recurring floods. I remember talking to Governor in Iowa, Chet Culver, and he showed me one time a mark on the wall, and he said, when they came into office, he said, that was a flood, how high it went, and he said, they told me, don't worry about it, Governor, because that was a 500-year flood. And he says, and here we are 3 years later recovering from another 500-year flood. Houston has had 3 of them in 5 years. Now, what that tells you, or should tell you, is how dramatic things are changing. And we see this ourselves. Ellicott City, the constant flooding that's been going on there. We were meeting with the county executive and going over some of these exact issues. They're debating how much to widen the channel and put new pipes in and all, but that's not the problem. The problem is what's going on upstream with losing our forest, the silting that's going on, and the impervious surfaces that are occurring. And in Baltimore County, and this is a scene that most of you know regularly. It's what we call sunny day flooding. And it's literally the water, the high tides, without a storm, backing up the storm drain system. Now, by the way, there is a short-term fix for that. But I mean, this is what we see increasingly. It's localized, but it can also be very destructive. Anne Arundel County is prominent on the red map, as we call it. Red map. Oh, we dropped the red map? Oh, sorry. Okay, there is a red map out there that you ought to look at it. We dropped it because it didn't have enough detail for this immediate area. But go to the state's our website and look at it. It shows you the areas that are likely impacted by storm damage, tidal storms, over the course of the next 25 years. Maryland is in for a real challenge. The lower eastern shore, southern Maryland, Baltimore County, Baltimore City, and Anne Arundel County. I live right on the bay. I can see what is happening, and what we have to recognize is in our planning and zoning and directions for the future, that this is a reality that we have to deal with. After we recognize these forces and outline what's going on, and again, we can do nothing. It makes no difference. These forces are out there. This is what is happening. Okay, so then the question becomes, what is the next step? And that's, of course, why we are here today. There are numerous tools. I'm not going to go through them in detail. We'll talk about some of the breakout sessions. They're readily available on our website. Anyone can go look at them for free, and we'll be working with the county government on some of these issues as well. But on the tools that we're talking about, let me just mention a couple, and keep in mind that policy and planning do matter. We didn't get here by not doing anything. We got here by doing the wrong things. And so if it matters, then let's think about some of the tools that we can do differently. First tool I'd recommend strongly is about designing our communities to create a sense of place. A sense of place meaning where people want to be. This is not it, by the way. This is not the sense of place that we want. Instead, we need communities that draw people. Now, obviously, we don't have this scale in Anne Arundel, but it's a significant example of what we're talking about in terms of attracting people, business, communities to our community. If you compare these two types of places, and we get to numerous slides and all that you can look at some point, you see what people are making decisions about. And you have to have a sense of place. There has to be a there in order to attract the business and retain the residents that we want to do, and to have people in the community. This is, what happened to this? So there we go. It is kind of neat. I could just sit here and look over there and the slide changes, a new form of electronics and everything. Thank you, Jerry. This is an interesting, in terms of place and mobility and everything else that we've had. If you notice the A and the B there, there's no connectivity between those. And so if someone were in residence A, and really wanted, for whatever reason, in a car, they would have to drive 7 miles to get to their neighbor. You'll be surprised on the subdivisions that are built on cul-de-sacs and this type of diagram all over America. We're continuing to build things exactly like this, where you can't walk to your faith community, you can't walk to your school, you can't walk to shopping, you can't walk anywhere. And so you get in your car, you become obese, and you add to the emissions in order to just go see your neighbor. And this is literally what is happening. And instead, we find overwhelmingly what people want is a sense of place. This is what they would prefer. This one I was looking for, in Boise. Boise, Idaho. You probably wonder, why would I have a slide up there in Boise and show that they're doing some interesting things? I mentioned my son earlier. He called me one time, I guess about a decade ago, and said, "Dad, have you ever been to Boise, Idaho?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He said he was out there for his work at about 3 weeks at a time. He said, "You know, this is really a neat town. I could see myself living here." Well, I want to tell you, and shortly after that, I was invited out to talk about smart growth. And I told them, they've already won half of the battle in terms of economic development and all, when a young person, a millennial, calls and says to his parents, "I could see myself living here." Now, fortunately, by the way, he did not, and as I said, he lives down in D.C. But this becomes part of the thing. I also, in fairness now, my daughter, Bree, rides equestrian. In fact, started right down the street, close to your farm, rides equestrian competitively, and she had a fall and she had a concussion, and the outpatient treatment at Children's Hospital was in Silver Spring, and we would go over there for her concussion follow-up. And she stopped one day and she said, "Dad, why don't we live in a really neat place like this?" And I said, "Well, we do live in a really neat place. We live in Annapolis and we're right on the bay and everything else." She said, "No, Dad, look at this. This is a fun place." Now, I've got to tell you, and every parent's proud, but she's doing so extraordinarily well in school and all. There's no question in my mind, and I know this because she's looking at the colleges and I'm looking at the tuition for those colleges, but there's no question she's going to do extraordinarily well. And there's also no question she's already oriented to this sense of place where she wants to live. And so what we've got to recognize is across the country, people are making decisions. This one is an interesting one. It's from Normal, Illinois. And what they've done, that's a roundabout. That's a traffic circle, as we call them. And during the week, it's mostly about moving cars and stuff like that. But however, during the weekends and other occasions, it becomes closed as a major festival gathering place for people. Now, it's not that we expect this to be built all across the county, but we do expect, as people step back for a few minutes, to say, what would be a logical gathering place here? What would be a change that helps make a sense of place? And we're seeing this happen in so many places. Changes in planning and zoning should keep in mind that what we need is this sense of place. I would also, by the way, mention, very carefully, should be participating with us, but form-based zoning. This is in Nashville, Tennessee. Form-based zoning focuses much more on what do the buildings look like, how do the buildings relate to one another, how do they relate to the street, and so on, and not as much concern about what is in the buildings. We try to zone for condominiums and apartments and by age and residential. Oh, we don't want this commercial here and stuff like that. And the bigger question should be what is in the building and how does that relate and help create a community. I mention this because Marta Goldsmith is over here. She was introduced before. She's probably the expert in the entire country on form-based zoning, and she'll be participating with some of the groups and working there as well. The other, second major approach that is extraordinarily important in the transportation system itself, again, we won't go into detail, but we argue very strongly for complete streets. Complete streets simply mean that the streets should be available for all users. They should be available for cars, but also people and bicycles. And they should be available for people regardless of their mobility. I'm always struck, there's a intersection not far from where my office is, K Street and 16th. That is just a few blocks from the White House, right? And it is, depending on where you're crossing, but that particular intersection is 8, counting us 2 service lanes. 23 seconds is the pedestrian crossing line. Now, I try to stay fit and all. I got to tell you, 23 seconds, go, right? There is no sense there of people. It's a sense about how many left turns do you have and things of this type. And so we argue very strongly for the complete streets. This is an example and the question becomes, which do you prefer? That walking there is all over, including right on Forest Drive. There are places when you're walking along, now fortunately they just put one in a couple of years ago, where you're walking along and all of a sudden the sidewalk just stops, right? And I saw people, and again this sidewalk has gone in just a couple of years ago, but people walking from a couple of those subdivisions and apartments going down to the giant that's there and have to step out onto Forest Drive because there was no sidewalk, right? And so what we urge is that you think through some of these. This one is in South Bend, Indiana, and if you notice what has happened is you put actually something between the cars and the people. People want some type of separation. It doesn't have to be massive trees and all, but just something that says, I am here. The other part is it's got to be some activity, especially for your core areas where you're talking about. And that's why we recommend so strongly that there be commercial retail and things of this type on the ground floor of a lot of the new buildings. I would also remind you when you talk about a place like this, and this one is in Tennessee, Franklin, Tennessee, the value of trees everywhere, not only for environmental purposes and value, but it just becomes significant. And this wonderful county probably has more rules and regulations on forestation than just about any in the state. However, it's about implementation and protection as well. It's not just about having the rule on the books. This is Portland, Oregon, and we're not suggesting that at this stage there's going to be a transit system like this, but you can see what they did in the combination of transit, complete streets, forestation of the streets and the trees and the landscaping and things of this type. I will tell you we don't have time to go into it here, but at some point, this county, and the county executive and I have talked about this, joined with other counties, and they're like county executives now in all the corridor counties, have got to get serious behind a statewide transit system. We should not have our major important centers, like Annapolis, like Columbia, have no transit connection whatsoever to the rest of the state. I must tell you, it is one of the sad ironies of the process that when I go to my office in D.C., I have to drive. When I was chairman of the county council in Prince George's County, and they were widening Route 50 for what seemed like the 10th time, we recommended that they build a light rail down the center connecting to the metro. And we were told the density would never justify that. And now, I have to get in the car to drive this. You know why the rail stopped in Glen Burnie, and you know what can be done to connect the whole state. And it's not about adding more and more lanes to every highway that's out there. Let me conclude by the observation that what we have to recognize lastly is the cost of continuing to do business as usual. More than anything else, and this is a very practical matter, we should keep in mind that sprawl simply does not pay for itself. This low-density development here, when you think about the cost for the infrastructure, and by the way, infrastructure, don't just think about building that road or building that school. It's about the road, and it's what's on the road, meaning how many fire trucks and ambulances and everything else, and what's under the road, meaning your utilities and your internet and everything else, and then trying to figure out why are we building out here. Sprawl simply, no matter what they say, and no matter how expensive those homes will be, sprawl does not pay for itself. And if we keep that in mind, we can start to make, I think, different type of decisions. Second thing when we talk about the cost is that there are health implications, major health implications, including obesity, including asthma and other respiratory illnesses that come from building systems where you really can't walk and where you create the need for more and more transportation. The health impacts, in addition to there are social implications, abandoning the downtowns, abandoning the places, and having us instead just sit in traffic. You see the abandoned downtown, you see the traffic, and you can think very quickly of like scenes all over our state and all over our county. And most importantly, and the real costs are the fiscal implications. We have studies available, and please go online and look at that as you start delivering some of these. We have surveys all over the country that looks at the fiscal implication of different types of development. What we should keep in mind is decisions that are made now will determine the financial future of the county. And if we recognize that sprawl doesn't pay for itself, then we must consider how to do it differently. We also must keep a high priority on focusing on the mix of choices and size for housing. We are pricing people out of housing in a very major way, and it's got to be a significant consideration. Now, I hope your decisions later on, not the decisions, but your discussions, I think what's going to come out of this, the entire redirection by this afternoon of the county with a great consensus behind that. And if not, let me just ask that some of the things that you do suggest and do work on will be the future for the county. I would urge as well to focus on corridor development and corridor redevelopment. We're not a county that has a whole series of urbanized areas. We are a county that has a whole series of highway-oriented, underutilized corridors that have become problems in themselves. We should also remember this is not a question of growth or no growth. And I understand there are a few of you that wish it were that, but the reality is it's not a question of growth or no growth. It's a question of how we grow and where we grow. And if we keep that in mind, the basic question then becomes even more personal, and that is, where do our parents live? Where do our children live? And particularly if we continue the current pattern. Our future for Anne Arundel County should not be just about a roll of the dice, should not be left to chance. Our future should be the result of recognizing the forces that are going on in this country and then taking action to harness that energy. We can move toward a walkable, healthy, safe place with shared prosperity, communities with housing, jobs, and a place for everyone. To do so is a challenge, it's a vision, it's a stretch, but it's something that we ought to reach for, and we can do so together. I will be around all afternoon to participate in some of the discussions and get into more specifics, as will my colleagues on these questions as well. Thank you very much.